Hello guys, today we're reacting to this carnotaurus versus V-Rex. Carnotaurus from Disney. Now if you've seen the carnotaurus from Disney, he is a beast, but my money is on the V-Rex cause it's a dinosaur and it's a T-Rex, and T-Rexes beat carnotauruses in like basically everything. Maybe.
Today, in the battle arena, two colossal, voracious meat-eaters from two eras face each other for the first time ever. On one end, the veteran of the evolutionary arms race in the most dangerous place in the planet's history, the modern-day successor from the line of tyrant kings, Vastatosaurus Rex. On the other, the feared, bloodthirsty demon bull from the southern prehistoric wilds, armed from head to toe with nightmarish weapons and armor, Carnotaurus robust is Floridana from Disney's Dinosaur. These two fictional species will go head-to-head as we study their armor, weapons, strengths, and weaknesses that will determine which of these creatures would come out alive from a fight to the death. No order given, no mercy shown. So stay till the end to witness the bloodiest showdown yet on Goji Center's Monster Face-Off. This battle will feature two fictional theropod super species. One, a speculative depiction of what T-Rex would have evolved into, taking many variables into account, and the other being an Abelisaur on steroids times 2. A gestalt of Carnotaurus Tyrannosaurus amped up even more. In this episode, you'll find the size and mobility are attributes that we will be paying very close attention to, since both real-life Carnotaurus and Tyrannosaurus Rex had different advantages in mobility. But today, these might not play out exactly how you think. You'll find out soon. Pay close attention as we begin with section number 1, size. Mass and corporal build will be taken into account for this part of the analysis. Note that the fight today is between CGI-depicted creatures, and in the movies, the sizes change quite a bit for them to fit on the frame and simply to look good on the camera. Thankfully, some of the official stats seen in the media and DVD special featurettes will come in to help us out. Secondary media, like toys and children's books, tend to give contradictory info, so those will be left out to make today's Rumble the most even matchup possible. The Ravager, king of Skull Island, was a species evolved from the already robust Tyrannosaurus Rex, turning even stockier, bigger, and heavier. There were 3 of these seen in the film, and we're going to be using the most experienced one of the bunch, the bull seen in the last skirmish, and one that King Kong nearly didn't walk away from. Comparing the bull to Kong, we can get a good benchmark that is somewhat shorter at the hip than the ape is at the top of his head. This is identical as shown in the book World of Kong, A Natural History of Skull Island, an invaluable source of information for today and for a future fight coming right around the corner. Now, this size chart doesn't give exact metrics, but matching them with what is seen in the book and using Ann Darrow's Naomi Watts as a measuring stick gives us a height of 5.6 meters tall at the hip and 15 to potentially 16 meters long from nose to tail. This is already leagues heavier than Tyrannosaurus Rex, but we need a number. Plugging these specs into our modeling software to get volumetrics, using average body density equations for T-Rex as provided by Laramendi & Co., we can get a shocking weight estimate of 24 to 27,000 kilograms. In freedom units, we're talking about 26 to 29 tons. It seems like a bit much, but consider how the V-Rex's hip measurements are the height of Jurassic Park's theropods at the top of the head. As film artist Greg Broadmoor put it regarding the making of the V-Rex, it wasn't about making a real dinosaur, it was about making it the most terrifying thing that Kong could fight. As for its horned nemesis, viewers of the channel may recall some of the exhaustive work we already went through figuring out how awesomely huge these apex abelisaurs are when we turned their horns against St. Hubert Island. Disney's Dinosaur had 2, likely even 3 different Carnos featured on screen. There's a bit of confusion as to who was who in the last act of this film, with the common belief that this Carno was the big one, while some shots suggest it was the smaller Carno that survived the cave collapse. So, for today's fight, we'll have to pick the Carnotaur size that is as close as possible to the V-Rex waiting on the other side of the ring. This Carnotaurus seen on screen in this shot is is as large as it gets, lining up pretty nicely with an official size chart provided by the home video release. This right here is the closest official metric we get with what we see in this scene, though the carno we see here could have been larger. That being because this 10-foot Pachyrhinosaurus is closer to the camera than the carno. This size chart seems to be showcasing the larger of the carno pair, so we have a measurement of 7 meters or 23 feet tall at the top of the head in this posture. Hip height at approximately 5.5 meters, and proportionally, using a 3D model as reference, we have a length of around 14.6 meters or more. For the weight of this creature, we won't quite use the same body density of a tyrannosaur multiplied by the volume. Abylosaurs are about as far removed from birds as you can get when it comes to Cretaceous theropods, often having denser bones and less air pockets than tyrannosaurs at the same size. Average body density is not too different, but it can factor. So, a while ago when we let loose 2 carnos on St. Hubert, we were pretty conservative in our prior weight estimates, as to give these poor inhabitants a chance. Today, not so much. Abylosaur density comes into play on top of using the higher weight estimate for these carnos, since we kind of did the same for V-Rex already. The horrible hornheads will enter the fight with a mass of 22 to 25,000 kilograms, or about 24 to 27 tons. Weight estimates for these animals differ by just around 2 tons for the lower and higher numbers. Barely a difference at this scale, but one still has a slight advantage. The V-Rex.
Does anybody remember that when the carnotaurus pulls the leg off a Abylosaur, pretty sure? Have anybody remember that?
T-Rex takes the first edge in this category. Whether it will be enough to secure a win will heavily depend on other factors coming up next. Enough to secure a win will heavily depend on other factors coming up next. Section 2. Armor. During the design process of these animals, it was a conscious choice to make these villain skins very different from their relatively smooth ancestors. So, Tyrannosaurs, the lineage which the fictional V-Rex hails from, were a deeply nested branch of the Coelurosaur family, all which had feathers to some degree or another. The director of this film wanted the Ravagers of Skull Island to look less like the Jurassic Park animals and more like the creatures from the older eras of filmmaking, like the 1933 original, that being almost looking like bipedal crocodiles. The Tyrannosaurs stranded on this island over millions of years developed thicker skulls, and it's not too hard to find out why. Studies from 2022 noted repeated patterns of injuries on T-Rex skulls, suggesting that this species used their heads as their primary weapons, and V-Rex was no different. The keratinous buildup on the brows of the T-Rex were also visible in the more modern V-Rex, but more exaggerated. In this arms race on an island where literally any creature is one misstep from getting flatlined, even the mighty descendant of T-Rex had to push it further. So, unlike its smooth ancestor, V-Rex featured thicker bony osteoderms and scales along their body, while T-Rex didn't quite need this armor, especially being agile already and fighting head-to-head with other T-Rexes. These V-Rexes faced a wider variety of dangers that might have instigated the development of this armor, especially useful against the larger variants of Venatosaurus, hordes of Therapus mordax, and the 2 most dangerous opponents it could face, another V-Rex and Megaprimatus Kong. These apes being possibly the most agile heavyweights in the island, and capable of easily getting around the heavily armored head, and running the danger of getting flanked by members of their own species. That's right. V-Rex, coming from an already agile lineage of T-Rex, took it a step further by changing the anatomy of their ribcage. A larger gap between the last ribs and the hips allowed V-Rex to sneak through the dense jungles of Skull Island. But those who are really familiar with the anatomy of T-Rex might notice something lacking in V-Rex: the gastralia. This has been greatly reduced since the Cretaceous and no longer offers the same protection. Carnotaurus, on the other hand, meanwhile draws traits from its real-life relatives and exaggerates them. During the production of Dinosaur, T-Rex was actually going to be the main antagonist, until newer developments in the late 90s. Carnotaurus was introduced as a potential villain, and it made it into production a lot bigger than its Cretaceous ancestor, and a lot more heavily armored. So the real-life Carnotaurus, unlike what was previously believed, did not have spiky armor, as was previously depicted. Instead, skin impressions preserved with the body show large feature scales, hardened plates of keratin embedded in the skin with no bones about it. Big Disney Carno, however, seemingly had a mixture of these two: hardened plates of keratin skin along its back and flanks, topped with spiky, bony armor. But it doesn't end here. Similar to Tyrannosaurs, Carnotaurus also fought with its head. A much more sturdy, thicker, and reinforced skull with keratin scales allowed this animal to absorb impacts. In fact, the debatably canon skeleton display in Disney World's Animal Kingdom Countdown to Extinction is actually a gestalt of Carnotaurus and Tyrannosaurus skeletons, the head being a mixture of these two animals and something that may play in favor of the Carno down in another section. Note that this guy may possibly have had a more reinforced ribcage as well, even though not explicitly
I think the carnotaurus wins in this time.
shown in the display at the theme park ride. Just like many other incomplete T-Rex skeletons, we do know for sure that both real-life Carnotaurus and Tyrannosaurus had more gastralia coverage than our V-Rex. Therefore, we can assume that Disney Carno likely had more armor in this area. V-Rex internally likely had the thicker skull. Carno is definitely not too far behind in that regard. V-Rex and Carno both have very well-armored backs. The Carno with a very high likelihood of being more armored internally in the abdomen, both with potential weaknesses that could be exploited depending on how these two fight. For now, we'll settle this as a draw for the two theropods. Section 3, Speed. Winning speed may not have seemed important to past face-offs. However, today, the winner of this edge will have the ability to pick when the fight happens, on what terms, moving rapidly to increase blows, retreating, or catching up to an opponent that wants to cut their losses and try to take off. So the Tyrannosaurinae was the group where all the largest tyrannosaurs like Chuchungtyrannus, Tarbosaurus, and T-Rex all hail from. These theropods would grow up in height and length in the first growth stage before they started to bulk up as adults. Looking at both the natural history of Skull Island and tie-in video games, we can see that young V-Rex do indeed have this agile build before they bulk up into their adult form. But at this scale, things do begin to change up on V-Rex. There is one difference in the internal anatomy of these two that might determine who wins this category. In cursorial predators that chase prey down over long distances, there is a certain golden ratio in the proportions of the upper leg versus the lower leg, involving a short and thick upper leg, but a longer lower leg. This allows for plenty of muscle attachment, meaning the upper leg only moves a shorter distance to swing the longer lower leg back and forth to cover more ground. This saves energy and preserves momentum while running long distances. But V-Rex's skeleton here shows that the proportions have changed from the ancestral Tyrannosaurs. A longer upper leg relative to the side of the lower leg, and it also tends to walk with a much more bent-legged stance. Now, this may be good for spectacle, as this makes the V-Rex move around more menacingly. However, this is the exact opposite of what one would want for high-speed directional movement. Carno, meanwhile, brings a build that manages this kind of speed even at a large size. Both the design and skeleton display at the theme park are a Frankenstein combo of the real-life Carno and T-Rex. So, quick parenthesis here, viewers of the channel have heard us rant before about how some animals are realistically too big to function properly. If that is you thinking that while watching these animals move, then yes, you're right, actually. However, in Monster Face-Off, this is literally one of the only physics warping phenomena we usually let slide lately. Otherwise, some of these fights would end up with both animals crushed under their own weight the moment we start the fight simulation. Disney Carno's build is a bit more optimized for long pursuits, and its real-life relatives were absolute speedsters. Thanks to caudofemoralis muscles in conjunction with its thick tail, this animal was able to hit top speeds and maintain them for a long time. A 2011 study by Dr. Scott Parsons and Dr. Philip J. Curry literally called this animal Dinosaur Speed Demon. Floridana also had a thick tail. Granted, it was more flexible, so it probably would get outrun by its real-life counterpart, but this one was seen to hold a sprint for a good amount of time, chasing down a herd of herbivorous dinosaurs, initiating the ambush from a very long distance instead of sneaking up on them in close proximity. And this happened twice. In this fight, the Carno, despite being almost just as heavy, has a better leg anatomy for speed, giving them the ability to set the terms for this fight. Edge, carnotaurus.
Ready?
Just as heavy, has a better leg anatomy for speed, giving them the ability to set the terms for this fight. Edge, carnotaurus. Section 4, Agility. Now is a good time to show where these guys are going to fight at the end of today's episode. Carnotaurus, as mentioned already, was seen hunting in open grasslands. Although V-Rex wasn't seen doing this in the movie, it is mentioned in the canonical tie-in book World of Kong, A Natural History of Skull Island. V-Rex did at times hunt in open plains. So, assuming that these two did live in the same landmass, it is very likely that these two specimens will eventually contest over territory. These environments may have trees, shrubs, rocks, and other variables in the terrain that could be leveraged by the one who is most agile. Carnotaurus sastre may have been a speedster. However, the same study that called it a speed demon did note that they had to slow down to turn, or run in a wide angle to change direction. Thankfully, however, Disney Carno does have a different body build, again, similar to T-Rex, though perhaps not exactly. Tyrannosaurs, coming from Coelurosaurs, did come from a lineage of agile animals that were used to maneuvering through dense terrain. The T-Rex's ilium or hip bone and muscle attachments made it possible for T-Rex to turn on a dime. Did Carnotaurus have this? Quite possible. Carnotaurus was also able to maneuver upwards on an incline on very uneven terrain, using its tail to turn its body radius enough for it to hit with considerable force. But one might think that these two so far are neck and neck in terms of agility. However, the Statosaurus Rex took it further. What initially seemed to be a weakness in armor now works in favor of V-Rex. It was mentioned in World of Kong that these rib bones, along with the arrangement of the spine, were reduced so as to let the V-Rex maneuver even more easily through the dense, shrinking terrain of this island. This evolved Tyrannosaur, apart from being even more agile, is now more flexible, and in a way, a less rigid body can help absorb more hits. See, we told you that certain aspects might not play out exactly how you think. In this case, it seems like an additional 66 million years of evolution and living in Skull Island came in handy for V-Rex to win this category. Edge. V-Rex. Section 5. Intelligence. Dinosaur intelligence has been a topic debated for decades, taking it a step further and comparing two fictional species, one being a
Okay, I think the V-Rex takes this, or maybe the Carnotaurus, probably the Carnotaurus, but my money's still on the V-Rex.
Speculatively evolved T-Rex, and another Anabellosaur that strayed far from its own family tree is going to be quite challenging, and we can only use their real-life relatives as a reference to a certain degree. So the general consensus is that many carnivorous theropods were broadly similar in intelligence to many modern predators like crocs, predatory birds, and some carnivorous animals. This spectrum may seem a bit broad, but don't underestimate crocodilians. These guys lately have been underrated for quite some time, while they possessed complex memory skills, deductive reasoning, use of tools, baiting prey, and even pack hunting. All things that most experts agree that Tyrannosaurs and Abellosaurs displayed. Both are capable of pulling off ambushes, understanding the importance of going incognito. Intelligence-wise, Tyrannosaurs were broadly the smartest of the large theropod dinosaurs, though Carnotaurs in particular did also show a lot of similarities, and was likely a cut above most Abellosaurs in the smart scale. In fact, some research on the brain anatomy indicated Carnotaurus was very similar to some Tyrannosaurs. So, does this dictate the edge in this category? Well, not so fast. There is one factor that does tilt the odds. The Carnotaurus in the movie were still healthy, generally diverse individuals that had just started experiencing an extinction event. V-Rex, on the other hand, during the events of 1933, have been enduring an ongoing extinction event that depleted their genetic diversity. Remember, this island was getting smaller over time. More conflicts between their own kind and the great apes brought both to the brink of extinction. This means generational inbreeding had already started affecting and afflicting the remaining V-Rexes. They may have been quite similar to a healthy individual. It's not like they were an RPG character that suddenly had their stats cut in half. But inbreeding has shown in modern species that physical and mental deformities come into play. One example is the captive populations of Bengal white tigers. This could also explain why the V-Rex in the movie acted so oddly at times. The filmmakers embraced the idea of these being inbred mutations, traits like mismatched teeth, altered torsos, and getting distracted a little too much by Anne during the fight. Now, some might argue that the V-Rex thought this was Kong's offspring, but even an animal of this caliber should have put two and two together to realize this was not Kong's offspring, and not an important threat in their fight versus King Kong. Instead of going for the clear weak spots or trying to handicap the ape, they instead went for Anne. Their priorities weren't quite straight here, especially since these two species were mortal enemies, and V-Rex seemed to have lost sight of the big picture here. When motivated, however, V-Rex does show some advanced problem solving, figuring out the swing mechanic while restrained and tied up in order to reach Anne. All three worked in coordination, especially this part, where the two V-Rex waited until the third one pulled up to then attack at once. Clearly, these are smart, but also also a bit clumsy with their priorities. Carnotaurus robustus floridana, on the other hand, displayed complex hunting methodology, quietly sneaking up to Bruton and Crato, nearly killing both, and them usually being portrayed as predators who lock in on the objective. Decision-making that nearly paid off had it not been for unforeseen circumstances. Once Carno changed his target from the herd to the more vulnerable Kron, it made the decision to attack the Hadrosaur despite being on top of hard terrain. Had it not been for the unstable platform, it's very likely that both Aladar and Nera would have also been lunch. For this category, the fact that this particular V-Rex was afflicted with neurological issues due to inbreeding and lost sight of the bigger picture at play gives the already intelligent Carnotaur an edge in intelligence. Had this been a more genetically balanced V-Rex from eons ago, the edge would have ended up with the Tyrannosaur. But sometimes better tools can offset the balance of power. And what better than the next category?
If your phone always sounds too
Section number 6, senses. Let us now focus on both of these animals' heads for a bit and study some sensory organs to see who is likely to lock in on targets better. One thing the CT scan of a Carnotaurus brain did show was that parts of T-Rex and Carno brains looked pretty different. T-Rex and Carno's olfactory bulb were comparable, but the portion devoted to eyesight was larger in T-Rex. Not that Carnotaurus had bad vision, no, but T-Rex had far better vision in terms of differentiating light from dark colors. Interestingly, even if it was by mere coincidence, in the film we find Carnotaurus have a hard time spotting Aladar in the cave, only spotting him when lightning lit up the cave entrance. So, while the 1930s generations of V-Rex may have had some deformities already, even inbreeding can only nerf an animal to some degree. Deformed or not, this snout leaves room for a much larger sinus cavity. Since this species presumably lived on this isolated landmass for millions of years, the sensory organs might have become more advanced and fine-tuned to pick up the slightest nuance in a heavily concentrated island with hundreds or even thousands of life forms. Comparing their line of sight, and V-Rex seems to have more binocular vision, being able to lock in on targets with better depth perception. That's if it decides to focus on the task at hand. The range of hearing for both of these creatures was probably broadly similar. Investigations into the inner ear show both Carnotaurus and Tyrannosaurus were well acute at hearing very low-frequency sounds below 3 kilohertz. So, who wins the edge? At a distance, both of them would be roughly on par to detect each other with sound or smell. As they approach, V-Rex will spot the Carno first, but since this fight takes place in an open field, no real advantage is played here. What will matter today is the fact that V-Rex has better depth and light perception. In range, the V-Rex would have the slight advantage of picking his target slightly better. Edge, V-Rex. Section 7, Bite Effectiveness. It goes without saying that the two primary weapons for these juggernauts are the very obvious business ends of their body. These jaws eclipse all other beasts of the land seen in the fossil record. Starting us out, the Carnotaurus has an absolutely monstrous head. May not be immediately obvious in the movie, seemingly smaller in comparison to the iguanodons, but don't forget that either of these two iguanodons are quite large themselves. Today, we'll look at the amount of mouthful these two can crunch on, bite force, and the type of teeth at play here. To figure out a ballpark estimate of bite force, we'll be using formulas and data from Dr. Sakamoto. Then come up with a weighted average of what the bite of a robust Carnotaurus is, halfway between the size of an actual Carnotaurus and Tyrannosaurus. Then from here, scale up the jaw to the size of Carnotaurus robustus. Being a bit less conservative as we were prior, the resulting crunching force measures as high as 53 to 74,000 newtons. And all of this is focused on thick serrated teeth capable of shredding. Note, these kinds of teeth aren't quite the best for crunching like a T-Rex, but we are now talking about a good combination of slicing and crunching. Additionally, the fact that the robustus's skull is a lot wider than Sastre's suggests that this larger Carno comes equipped with extra muscles, necessary to bite harder than an equal-sized, narrower skull. This again is another perk of being an Abelisaur that adopted some physical traits of the wider-jawed Tyrannosaur. In other books, it's even mentioned that this Carno's jaws are wide enough to be able to swallow a human whole. The V-Rex has quite a reputation to uphold. As the size of an animal increases, the weight of the animal in question will increase at an even faster rate. This is square cube law action. So every muscle of these animals, including the jaw, will now have to work even harder against gravity. This is why when you double the size of a theropod, it doesn't automatically mean double the bite force. And this V-Rex, twice the size of a T-Rex, will not have more than double the bite force. And the work by Dr. Sakamoto supports this, since we have smaller Tyrannosaurs, half the mass of Tyrannosaurus Rex, but with more than half the chomping force. So, after observing the skull of this creature, we noticed something interesting. After 66 million years of evolution, the jaw structure actually changed a bit. Stouter and more robust in some regions, but leaner in others.
It looks like he's smiling at us.
Oh, you see here in the back of the skull, combined with this one on top of the head, are primary attaching points for the jaw muscles to work in tandem with the mandible. What does this mean? These progressively shrinking keyhole shapes mean that V-Rex changed the way it bit down on victims, trading off bite force for a larger size. Since being this big, and its chomp was already more than enough, otherwise at this scale, V-Rex would likely smash its own skull. With this in mind, V-Rex would probably be a ballpark figure of 70 to 85,000 newtons of force, hugely gargantuan, and a big reason for the downfall of the Mega Primatus Kong species. To figure out the edge, some of these weird tooth deformities may work in favor of this particular V-Rex. V-Rex has the stronger bite and wins this edge, but something to note here is that both of these animals have the necessary force needed to kill the opponent if bitten on the right spot. So, while V-Rex wins this edge, landing hits is critical. Other weapons may open different opportunities. 8 auxiliary weapons. The jaws might be the business end, but either of these two have more than enough weight to throw around and use their body parts as devastating weapons. We'll be comparing the brow region of these animal skulls as well as the tail. Now, a big factor is rotation speed, which we already settled that the V-Rex would likely hold a slight advantage here. Had this been a hugely superior rotation speed, then we'd end this section and call it for V-Rex. However, we are dealing with a megatheropod with a very special set of weapons on its tail and brow regions. Starting with the skull, Carnotaurus robustus has been seen on screen to use these as a mace. Topped with a thicker, wider skull, the slightly slower rotation speed of Carno is made up by an impact inflicted by a smaller surface area, that being the small tips of these horns. Similarly to how the V-Rex's teeth snagged an edge in the previous section, the Carno's horns now have more piercing power. Against an armored opponent, it may at first seem confusing as to how these blows could pierce. Well, in the film, almost every blow from the Carno's horns were aimed low. And without a castralia to help guard against these blows, these may prove a lot more effective than a blow.
Guys, this is the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe for part 2, because I need a part 2, and I will attend to this. Bye, guys.